I didn't cry when they told me my name wasn't on the list, and that scared me more than if I had, because for a second I just stood there blinking like my body hadn't caught up with what my ears had heard, like, "Ha, sorry, what did you say?" I remember smoothing the front of my dress with my palm, the same way I used to do when my hands shook at parent-teacher meetings, and I said my son's name again, slowly this time, thinking maybe I'd spoken too softly the first time. Maybe the music was loud, maybe the moment would fix itself if I gave it another chance. But the girl at the table didn't look at me again. She looked sideways at the man next to her, then back at the clipboard, then up at me with that tight, polite smile people use when they've already decided you're a problem they don't want to solve. And she said it again, softer now, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry, ma'am, your name isn't here." And something inside my chest made a small, dry cracking sound, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, just enough for me to notice. Sigh, so this is how it happens. Around me the place was glowing, white flowers everywhere, glass doors open to a garden so perfect it looked fake, laughter floating out in pieces, the kind of laughter that says nobody here is worried about money or tomorrow or whether they're loved. And for a split second I felt like I'd walked into the wrong movie, like I'd missed a scene where someone explained that I wasn't supposed to be here at all. I opened my mouth to say I was his mother, because that's what you do, right? You state the obvious. You reach for the one title you think can't be erased. And before the words could fully leave me, I heard her voice, sharp but lazy, amused in a way that stings more than anger ever could, my daughter-in-law stepping closer, eyes flicking over me like she was scanning a price tag, and she said, "Did you really think you'd be invited?" And ha, it wasn't funny. Not at all, but my mouth did this strange thing where the corners almost lifted, not a smile, more like a reflex, like my face was trying to protect me by pretending this was a joke I could laugh off later. People nearby pretended not to listen while listening very hard. You can always tell, their heads angled just slightly wrong, their eyes too alert, the quiet thrill of watching someone else be embarrassed so you don't have to think about your own fears. And I felt it then, that heat crawling up my neck, that familiar old shame that says maybe they're right, maybe you don't belong in places like this, maybe you never did. I wanted to ask where my son was, I wanted to hear it from him. I wanted him to look at my face and explain why his own mother was standing outside his wedding like a stranger. But something stopped me, not pride exactly, more like exhaustion, all the kind that settles into your bones after years of telling yourself to be patient, to be understanding, to not make things harder for the people you love. So I nodded just once, slow, calm, like I was agreeing to a plan I'd known about all along. "I understand," I said, and my voice didn't shake, which surprised me, and that scared me too, because when your voice doesn't shake at moments like this, it means you've crossed into a different place entirely. I turned away before anyone could say anything else, before anyone could soften it or sharpen it, and as I walked I could feel every step, the gravel under my shoes, the sun warm on my arms, the sound of the music growing fainter behind me, like a door slowly closing on a life I thought I was still part of. I didn't run, I didn't look back, I didn't even hurry. Each step felt deliberate, like I was choosing something without fully knowing what it was yet, and the strangest part was the quiet, no dramatic music, no shouting, just the normal sounds of the world continuing as if nothing important had happened at all, and that hurt more than the words. When I reached my car, I sat there for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing in and out, the way I used to teach my son when he was little and scared of the dark, whispering that it would pass. That feelings always do, and I felt this wave of memories hit me all at once. Him in a too big backpack on his first day of school, him asleep at the kitchen table while I finished another late shift, him promising he'd always take care of me someday, and isn't it funny how promises don't break all at once, they just thin out over time until one day there's nothing left to hold on to. I started the engine and pulled away, not knowing where I was going exactly, just knowing I couldn't stay there, not like that, not standing outside waiting to be allowed into my own child's life. Somewhere between the venue and the first red light, a thought slipped in that made my chest tighten again, not with pain this time, but with something heavier, something steadier. If it was this easy for them to erase me today, then maybe they'd already erased me long before this moment, and today was just the first time I could see it clearly. If this story is already making you feel that quiet ache, that familiar knot in your stomach, you might want to stay with me, because sometimes the softest moments are the ones that change everything. I drove on, the sky too blue, the afternoon too normal, my phone silent in the seat beside me, and I had no idea yet that this silence wouldn't last, that the quiet I was sitting in was only the beginning. Because while I was driving away with my hands steady and my eyes dry, something else had already started moving, something none of them expected, and 5 hours later, everything they thought they knew was about to turn upside down. I didn't go home right away after I left, not because I had somewhere else to be, but because I wasn't ready to sit inside those four walls with my thoughts echoing back at me, so I drove without much care for direction. Letting red lights decide when I paused and green ones push me forward, and with every block I felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because I wasn't standing there anymore pretending I was fine. Heavier because now there was nothing to distract me from the truth that kept tapping at the back of my mind. Sigh, they didn't forget my name, they removed it. The streets blurred past, people crossing roads, shops opening and closing, life moving like it always does, and I kept thinking how strange it was that my whole world had tilted while everyone else was just buying groceries or arguing over parking spots. And isn't that how it always is? Your worst day is just another Tuesday for the rest of the world. I thought about turning on the radio but decided against it. Silence felt more honest, even if it pressed on my ears, even if it gave my memories too much room to stretch out, memories I hadn't invited but that came anyway. Like my son at 5 years old running toward me with a paper crown he'd made at school, shouting that he was king for the day and that I had to bow. And I'd laughed and bowed low in our tiny kitchen, telling him, "Yes, Your Majesty." Because back then my place in his life was unquestioned, solid, real. Somewhere along the road, my hands tightened on the wheel, and I had to remind myself to breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, the way I used to do when money ran short and panic tried to climb up my throat. All old habits don't leave you just because your circumstances change. I pulled into a small parking lot near a quiet park and shut the engine off, sitting there with the hum of cooling metal around me, watching a couple on a bench argue softly, their words lost to distance but their body language loud enough. And I wondered if my son and his wife were arguing too, or laughing, or dancing, or if I even crossed their minds at all now that I was gone. That thought stung more than the words at the entrance, the idea that my absence might actually make things easier for them, smoother, cleaner, like sweeping dust into a corner and closing the door. I got out of the car and walked slowly along the path, gravel crunching under my shoes, leaves shifting in the breeze, and I realized I wasn't angry the way I thought I'd be. There was no fire, no urge to march back and demand answers, just this dull, hollow ache that felt almost peaceful in a dangerous way, like giving up without admitting you've done it. I remembered all the times I'd told myself to stay small, to not draw attention, to not embarrass him in front of his friends or his teachers, or later his college roommates. All those little choices that seemed loving at the time, protective, and I wondered when they'd quietly turned into permission for him to be ashamed of me. My phone stayed face down in my bag. I didn't want to see it light up or stay dark. Both felt like answers I wasn't ready for. And as I walked, I thought about how many years I'd spent making myself easy to overlook, easy to explain away, easy to fit into whatever story made other people comfortable. Maybe I'd taught him too well. A woman passed me pushing a stroller, humming to herself, and for a second my chest tightened with something close to weeping, because I saw myself in her, younger, tired, hopeful, believing that if you just did enough, loved enough, sacrificed enough, the people you loved would always see you, really see you. I sat on a bench and closed my eyes, letting the sun warm my face, letting the noise of the city fade into something softer, and I told myself not to spiral, not to turn one moment into a lifetime sentence, but the truth kept circling back, quiet and stubborn. Today wasn't just about a guest list, it was about who I was allowed to be in my son's new life, and I'd been gently but firmly placed outside of it. I stayed there longer than I planned, until my legs felt stiff and the light shifted, and when I finally stood up I noticed something that made me pause. My bag felt heavier than it had earlier, not because anything had changed, but because I'd suddenly remembered what was inside it, something I'd carried so long it had become invisible to me, something no one at that wedding had thought to ask about or notice, and the thought sent a strange calm through me. Steady and grounding, like placing your feet firmly on the floor after nearly losing your balance. I walked back to my car with a different posture, not taller exactly, just more certain. And as I drove away from the park toward home, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, eyes red but clear, mouth set but not bitter, and I realized that walking away quietly hadn't been weakness, it had been choice, and choices have a way of rippling outward whether people see them or not. When I reached my street and parked, the building looked the same as it always did, familiar and unimpressive, and for the first time that day I felt something like relief, because here, at least, I existed without needing permission. I went inside, set my bag down, and sat at the table without turning on a single light, letting the room stay dim and honest. And as I rested my hands in front of me, I felt that weight again, solid, patient, waiting. And I knew then that the story wasn't done just because I'd left quietly. It was only paused, gathering itself, because somewhere else, far away from this small room, the truth I carried was starting to surface. And when it did, the silence around my phone wouldn't stay silent for very long. They always thought they knew my life. And maybe that was the strangest part of all, not that they judged it, but that they felt so sure about it. Like a few visible details were enough to explain everything about who I was and what I mattered. And as I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, shoes kicked off, bag resting on the chair beside me, I let that thought roll around in my head. People love simple stories, especially when those stories make them feel bigger. The room smelled faintly of tea and old books, the kind of smell you only notice when you stop rushing, and I stared at the small marks on the wall I'd never bothered to fix, reminders of other years, other worries, other versions of myself, and I realized how carefully I'd built this life to look exactly the way it did, modest, unremarkable, easy to overlook, like a background character in someone else's scene. I could almost hear the assumptions lining up in their heads: waitress, small apartment, old car, tired hands, end of story. And I'd let them believe it because it made things easier, because it kept questions away, because it allowed me to move through the world without being pulled apart by expectations or demands. I thought about the first time I'd chosen this, standing years ago in a different kitchen, holding a decision that could have changed everything overnight, and feeling this deep, steady certainty that money could build walls just as easily as it could open doors. And I didn't want my son growing up behind either. I wanted him to know what effort felt like, what patience felt like, what it meant to earn rather than expect. So I worked and worked and worked some more double shifts, aching feet, smiles I didn't always feel, telling myself it was all part of something bigger, something that would make sense one day. Funny how the days that are supposed to explain everything often end up confusing it even more. I stood and poured myself a cup of tea, the kettle's soft sound filling the room, and as the steam rose, I felt my shoulders finally drop, just a little, like my body had been waiting all afternoon for permission to relax, and I laughed quietly at myself, ha ha ha. Imagine needing permission in your own home. I carried the cup to the table and wrapped my hands around it, letting the warmth seep in, and my eyes drifted to my bag again, to the weight inside it that had started to feel louder now, not urgent, not demanding, just present, like a truth that doesn't need to shout to be heard. I remembered all the times my son had said, "Mom, you work too hard," and how I'd shrugged it off, told him it was nothing, that I liked staying busy, never explaining the real reason, never telling him that sometimes the hardest work isn't the hours you put in. It's the restraint, the decision to not use what you have, to not take the easy way when it's offered, to trust that character matters more than comfort. Somewhere along the way, though, that lesson had twisted, or maybe it hadn't landed at all, because today I'd seen how easily he'd stepped into a world where appearances mattered more than people, where fitting in was more important than standing by the woman who raised him, and the realization sat heavy in my chest, not as anger, but as disappointment, deep and quiet. I took a slow sip of tea and closed my eyes, letting myself feel it, the awe of it, the ache of loving someone who has grown into a stranger without even meaning to, and I wondered if this was what all parents eventually face, the moment you realize your child's choices are no longer yours to guide, only to respond to. My phone lay untouched on the table, dark and still, and part of me wanted it to stay that way forever, to freeze time right here where I could breathe and think and remember who I was outside of today's hurt. But another part of me knew that stillness never lasts, not when truth is involved. I opened my bag then, not all the way, just enough to see the edge of what I'd been carrying, enough to remind myself that this life they thought they understood was only one layer, one chapter, and that the rest had been written carefully, quietly, over years of choosing patience over pride. I didn't feel powerful in that moment, not in the way movies make power look. There was no thrill, no rush, just a steady calm, the kind that comes when you stop questioning your own choices and start accepting them fully. I smiled to myself, small and tired but real, and whispered, "You did the best you could," not as an excuse but as a truth, because I had, even if the outcome wasn't what I'd hoped. Outside, a car door slammed. Someone laughed, life moved on, and inside my small apartment I sat with the knowledge that being underestimated can be a strange kind of freedom, one that lets you see people clearly while they're still convinced they see you. I reached for my phone then, not to check it yet, just to feel its weight in my hand, to acknowledge that whatever came next would come whether I was ready or not. And as I set it back down, I felt that same quiet certainty settle in again, the one that had guided me for years, whispering that this story was far from over. Because the version of me they thought they knew was about to collide with the truth they never bothered to look for, and when that happened, nothing would feel simple ever again. 5 hours sounds like nothing when you say it out loud, like a gap you can blink through, but living inside those hours is different, every minute stretching and folding over itself while the world quietly rearranges things you can't yet see. And I felt that strange stretch as the afternoon slid into evening, light thinning at the edges of the room, shadows growing longer without asking permission. I moved slowly, deliberately, like if I rushed I might knock over something fragile inside myself. So I rinsed my cup, wiped the counter even though it was already clean, folded a sweater that didn't need folding, Ha, the kind of small tasks you do when your hands need something to hold on to while your mind catches up. Every now and then my thoughts drifted back to the wedding, to the look on her face, to the way my son hadn't been there at all, and each time I felt that familiar sting I gently pulled myself back, telling myself not yet, not now, because there would be time later to feel everything fully, and I didn't want to break before I understood what was happening. I sat by the window and watched the street below, neighbors coming home, someone carrying groceries, someone else arguing on the phone, ordinary scenes that felt oddly comforting, like proof that life keeps its rhythm even when your own heart is offbeat. And I sighed, long and slow, feeling the day finally start to settle into my body. My phone stayed quiet on the table, face down, and I noticed how often my eyes flicked toward it anyway, how my chest tightened each time I imagined it lighting up, because silence can be just as loud as noise when you're waiting for something to happen. I told myself stories to pass the time, that maybe they were too busy celebrating to notice I was gone, that maybe this would all fade into an awkward memory everyone pretended didn't exist. And for a moment I almost hoped that would be the case, because fading is easier than confronting, easier than watching people you love realize they've crossed a line they can't step back over. As the sky deepened into that soft blue that comes before night, I felt a shift inside me, subtle but unmistakable, like standing at the edge of something and knowing you've already stepped forward even if your feet haven't moved yet. And that scared me more than anything else so far. I made another cup of tea and sat back down, this time leaving the lights off, letting the room glow only with what little came in from outside. And as I sipped, I thought about how many times in my life I'd waited like this. Waited for bills to be paid, waited for answers from schools or landlords or doctors, waited for my son to come home late at night when he was a teenager, and I pretended not to worry. And I realized waiting had always been part of who I was, but this felt different, heavier, charged with something I couldn't yet name. Somewhere far away, I imagined the wedding winding down, speeches given, glasses clinking, people leaning in close to whisper their opinions, and I wondered when my absence would finally be noticed, when someone would ask the obvious question, and what answer they'd give before the truth surfaced. My heart beat a little faster at that thought, not from fear exactly, but anticipation, like standing behind a curtain listening to the murmur of an audience before the lights come up. Life has a strange sense of timing when it wants to teach someone a lesson. The room felt smaller as the minutes passed, not cramped, just intimate, like it was holding its breath with me, and I found myself talking out loud without realizing it, soft words meant only for myself, reminding myself that I'd survived worse days than this, days when there was no wedding, no car, no certainty at all, just grit and hope and the stubborn decision to keep going. I checked the clock once and only once, then forced myself not to again, because I didn't want to measure this moment. I wanted to live through it, to be present enough to recognize the exact second when everything changed. And then finally it happened, not with a bang or a knock or a shout, but with a small vibration against the table, barely noticeable, my phone humming softly like it was clearing its throat. And I froze, breath caught halfway in, staring at it without touching it, because something deep inside me knew this was the beginning of the end of the quiet. I didn't pick it up right away, I let it stop, let the silence return for just a heartbeat longer, and as I reached out at last, fingers brushing the edge, I felt that calm settle in again, steady and grounded. The calm that comes when you realize you're no longer waiting to see what will happen, you're waiting to see how people will react to what already has, because somewhere during those 5 long hours, the truth had slipped into the room they thought they controlled, and now it was ringing, again and again, asking to be answered. By the time I finally turned the phone over, the screen glowed like it had been waiting for me, bright and almost impatient, and for a second I just stared at it without processing the numbers. Funny how your eyes can see something before your mind is ready to accept it. 18 missed calls, not 1, not 2, but 18, stacked on top of each other like proof that the silence I'd been sitting in hadn't been empty at all. It had been loud somewhere else. My son's name appeared again and again, mixed with numbers I didn't recognize, and there it was too, her name, the same one that had looked at me earlier like I was an inconvenience that should have stayed home. I didn't feel the rush I expected, no sudden triumph, no sharp satisfaction, just this slow, spreading heaviness in my chest, because seeing those calls didn't erase what had happened. It only confirmed that something irreversible had already been set in motion. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding, long and shaky, sigh, so now you remember me. The phone buzzed again in my hand, vibrating like a nervous heartbeat, and instinctively my thumb hovered over the screen before pulling back, because answering felt like opening a door I wasn't sure I wanted to walk through yet. I set the phone down gently, face up this time, and watched it light up again, and again, each buzz carrying its own tone, urgency growing, desperation creeping in, and I thought about how different this felt from earlier, how different it felt from standing at that entrance being told I wasn't on the list, because then I'd been invisible, and now I was suddenly very, very visible. I laughed quietly to myself, a soft, humorless sound, ha ha ha. Isn't it strange how quickly people start looking when they realize something valuable might be slipping away? My hands trembled a little, not from fear, but from the weight of what those calls represented. Questions forming on the other end of the line, panic, confusion, maybe even regret, all wanting something from me without yet knowing what I was willing to give. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself some water, the glass clinking lightly against the counter, and I focused on that small sound, grounding myself in the present, reminding myself that I didn't owe anyone an immediate response, not now, not ever, just because they'd finally decided I mattered. As I sipped, my eyes kept drifting back to the phone, and I imagined the scene unfolding wherever they were, whispers turning into raised voices, someone checking records, someone realizing a mistake had been made, and my chest tightened again, not with anger, but with a kind of sad clarity, because none of this would have happened if I'd quietly stayed in my place like they expected. I picked the phone up again and scrolled slowly, reading names and numbers, noticing the shift in timing, calls coming closer together now, urgency compressing time, and it made my heart ache in a way I hadn't expected, because mixed into all that panic was my son, the child I'd raised, calling his mother not to say sorry yet, not to explain, but because something had gone wrong in his perfect day. If you've ever loved someone who only noticed your value when things started falling apart, you might want to stay with this story, because moments like this reveal more truth than years of calm ever could. I sat back down at the table and placed the phone in front of me like a question waiting to be answered, and I whispered almost to myself, not yet, because whatever I said next, whenever I said it, would matter in ways I couldn't undo. The phone buzzed again, stronger this time, and I didn't flinch, didn't rush, just watched as the screen lit up once more, knowing that each unanswered call was tightening something on the other side, pulling the story forward whether I participated or not. And as the vibration finally stopped, leaving the room quiet again, I realized this wasn't about missed calls at all. It was about control shifting hands. And I was standing right at the center of it, calm, silent, deciding when, and if I would finally speak. I didn't need anyone to explain what was happening to know that the truth had finally slipped out, because panic has a very specific sound even when you can't hear it, a certain rhythm that shows up in the way people reach for you all at once, and I felt it in the sudden urgency of those calls, in the way the silence around me no longer felt empty but charged, like the air before a storm. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting that awareness settle in. So this is the part they never planned for, the moment when the story they've been telling themselves doesn't match the facts anymore. Somewhere far away from my small, quiet room, people were piecing things together, names being checked, records being pulled, whispers moving faster than music ever could, and I imagined the look on their faces when they realized that the woman they'd dismissed at the door wasn't just a forgotten guest. She was a problem they hadn't known how to name until now. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message instead of a call, and I didn't open it, not because I was afraid of what it said, but because I already knew the tone, the careful politeness giving way to unease, the sudden need to explain, to soften, to rewrite what had happened earlier that day. I sighed and rubbed my temples, feeling the weight of years press gently but firmly against me, remembering all the times I'd been underestimated and how often that had worked in my favor without anyone noticing. The truth doesn't always arrive loudly, it seeps in. It spreads through rooms and conversations until suddenly everyone is standing in it wondering how they got wet. I thought about the first crack that must have formed, someone asking an innocent question, someone else answering a little too honestly, a detail surfacing that didn't belong in the neat version of the story they'd been celebrating, and from there everything else unraveling. Lies don't collapse, they unravel, slow and messy. I stood and walked to the window again, watching the street lights flicker on below, and for the first time that day I felt something close to relief, not because I wanted anyone to suffer, but because the burden of being unseen had finally lifted, replaced by something clearer, sharper, more honest. My phone buzzed yet again, and this time I glanced at the screen just long enough to see the change. No more clipped names, no more confident timing. Now there were pauses, gaps, hesitation, calls coming in clusters, and then stopping, like whoever was dialing was arguing with themselves before trying again. I couldn't help the small laugh that escaped me, soft and tired. Ha ha ha. Power doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself when other people start scrambling. I sat back down and let my thoughts drift to my son, picturing him standing somewhere unfamiliar in his own celebration, confusion creeping in as he realized something had gone wrong that couldn't be fixed with a speech or a smile, and my chest tightened again, because even now, even with all of this unfolding, I didn't want to hurt him, I just wanted him to understand. That was the hardest part, the space between wanting justice and wanting your child safe from the consequences of his own choices. And no one ever tells you how heavy that space can feel. The messages kept coming, apologies wrapped in formality, explanations offered too late, and I let them sit unread, not out of cruelty, but because I needed them to exist in that uncertainty for a while, to feel what it's like when control slips through your fingers and you don't know who's holding it. I poured myself another cup of tea, noticing how steady my hands were now, and as the kettle clicked off, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore, not really. The sharp edge had dulled into something calmer, something that felt like resolve. Whatever had been hidden was no longer hidden. Whatever had been assumed was now being questioned, and whether they liked it or not, they were being forced to see me as more than a role they could edit out. I sat back down with my tea, phone still buzzing on the table, and I knew then that the next step wouldn't be about shock or revenge. It would be about what I chose to do with the truth now that it was out. Because once the truth shows itself, the story doesn't end. It demands a decision, and that decision was coming, closer with every unanswered call. The calls didn't stop, but they changed, and that shift was impossible to miss because urgency has layers, and I could hear the difference even without answering. The earlier sharp panic softening into something more exposed, more human, and somehow more unsettling. I picked the phone up again, and this time I listened to one voicemail, just one, my son's voice coming through thin and uneven, words tripping over each other, him saying my name the way he used to when he was little and scared, and my chest tightened so suddenly I had to press my hand flat against it. There it is, the sound that still knows how to undo me. He wasn't asking yet, not properly. He was explaining, rushing, trying to put order back into a day that had slipped out of his control, and I could hear the confusion underneath, the realization dawning that something important had gone wrong long before the guest list was printed. I didn't listen to the rest. I couldn't, not yet, so I ended the message and sat there breathing through the ache, reminding myself that love doesn't disappear just because it's been hurt, it just gets heavier to carry. Another message came in almost immediately, this one shorter, more careful, her voice now, softer than it had been earlier, the sharpness sanded down by fear, offering apologies that sounded practiced but still desperate, and I laughed under my breath. Ha ha ha, isn't it strange how tone changes when the ground shifts beneath you? I let that one in too, my thumb hovering over the screen before setting the phone back down, because answering felt like opening a door I wasn't ready to step through, and I knew once I did, there would be no going back to this quiet. The room felt warmer now, closer, like it was leaning in to listen with me, and I stood up just to move, to remind myself I still could, pacing slowly from window to table and back again, my thoughts looping, colliding, settling, and rising all at once. I thought about my son again, about the years when his problems were scraped knees and lost homework, things I could fix with a hug or a late-night run to the store, and I felt that familiar sting of realizing how little control you have once your child grows into their own choices. My phone buzzed again, then again, the pauses between calls growing shorter, and I noticed something else now too, the names changing, new numbers appearing, people I'd never heard from before suddenly needing me, needing answers, needing reassurance, and sigh. That was when it hit me just how wide the ripples had spread. I sat back down and closed my eyes, letting myself feel the sadness fully this time, letting it wash through without pushing it away, because pretending not to feel it wouldn't make me stronger, it would only make me numb, and I didn't want that. I wanted clarity even if it hurt. When I opened my eyes, I felt steadier, grounded in a way that surprised me, like I'd finally accepted that whatever happened next would change things permanently, and that was okay. The phone buzzed once more, and I picked it up, not to answer, just to hold it, to acknowledge the weight of what it represented. And as I set it back down, I whispered, soon, not as a promise to them, but as a reminder to myself. Somewhere on the other end of those calls, people were realizing apologies alone wouldn't be enough, that explanations wouldn't rewind the day, and that understanding would come at a cost. And as I sat there in the dim light, listening to the quiet hum of my own home, I knew the next conversation wouldn't be about excuses or fear. It would be about choices, about consequences, about what comes after regret, and that moment, the one where everything would finally be said out loud, was closer now than ever. I sat there for a long time after the calls slowed, not moving, not thinking in straight lines, just letting the weight of it all settle where it needed to, because this was the part no one ever talks about, the space between being hurt and deciding what to do with that hurt. Revenge showed up first, loud and tempting, whispering how easy it would be to let the damage land where it may, to answer one call with the coldest voice I could manage and watch everything unravel from there. Ha ha ha, the thought almost made me smile, not because I wanted it, but because I understood it, because anyone who's been dismissed knows how good it feels to imagine finally being feared. But the smile faded just as quickly, replaced by something heavier, something older, the memory of every night I'd sat at a kitchen table counting coins. Every morning I'd tied my shoes and gone back out anyway, not because it was fair, but because it was right, because someone was depending on me to choose the harder path. I stood up and walked slowly around the room again, the floor cool under my feet, the air still, and I realized how quiet my mind had become now that the chaos was no longer inside it. The noise had moved outward, to them, and that shift felt like standing on solid ground after being tossed at sea. Power, real power, I thought, isn't loud. It doesn't need witnesses. It's the ability to pause when you could strike, to wait when you could rush, to choose meaning over momentary relief. And all that realization hurt more than any insult I'd heard earlier that day. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes, letting the image of my son rise without forcing it, his face as a child, open and trusting, then as a young man, confident and eager, and finally as he must be now, shaken, realizing that the life he'd stepped into had rules he didn't understand yet, rules that didn't bend just because you were scared. My throat tightened and for a second tears threatened, real ones this time, the kind that come from loving someone enough to let them feel the weight of their own choices, and I let one fall, just one, wiping it away with the back of my hand, because feeling it didn't mean I had to drown in it. The phone buzzed again, a single vibration, almost tentative now, and I didn't even look. I already knew what it would be, another attempt to pull me into their urgency, to make me fix something they'd broken, and I sighed long and slow, realizing that fixing it for them would be the easiest thing in the world and the most damaging. I thought about how many times I'd done exactly that over the years, smoothed things over, made excuses, absorbed the discomfort so my son wouldn't have to, and how maybe, without meaning to, I'd taught him that someone else would always clean up the mess. That thought settled heavily, not as blame, but as understanding, and understanding has a way of clarifying what comes next. I poured myself another cup of tea, noticing again how steady my hands were, and as I carried it back to the table, I felt something click into place, quiet and firm, the knowledge that whatever I chose now would echo for years, not just in their lives, but in mine. I wasn't interested in watching things burn. I didn't want apologies wrung out by fear, and I certainly didn't want my son's future shaped by panic rather than growth. I wanted something harder, something slower, something that required patience from all of us. I sat down, wrapped my hands around the warm cup, and for the first time since the morning, I felt fully present, fully myself, not the woman they'd dismissed, not the role they'd assigned me, but the person who'd survived enough to know that restraint can be stronger than retaliation. The decision didn't arrive with fireworks or relief. It arrived quietly, like a door closing behind me, and as I stared at the dark phone on the table, I knew that when I finally spoke, it wouldn't be to take something away, it would be to set terms, to redraw the lines in a way no one expected, and that choice once made would change everything that followed. When I finally stood up, it wasn't with anger or triumph, it was with a strange calm that felt heavier than both, like the kind you get after making a decision you know will cost you something no matter how it turns out. I picked up the phone, not to answer the calls flooding in, but to dial one number I hadn't used in a long time, and as it rang I felt that quiet certainty settle in again, the same one that had guided me through years of choosing patience over ease. The conversation was brief, measured, no emotion spilling over, just clear instructions and an understanding on the other end that what I was asking for wasn't about punishment, it was about responsibility. When I ended the call, the room felt different, like something had been set in motion that couldn't be undone, and I sat back down, letting out a slow breath, sigh. This was the part that would hurt the most, not for them, but for me. The phone rang again, and this time I answered, my son's voice breaking through immediately, rushed and raw, words tumbling out in apology and fear, him trying to explain himself before I could say anything at all, and I listened without interrupting, without correcting him, because he needed to hear his own words echo back in the silence. When he finally stopped, breath shaky, I spoke, not loudly, not coldly, just evenly, telling him that I wasn't there to yell, that this wasn't about revenge or humiliation, that what happened at the wedding had already been done and couldn't be erased. I told him I loved him, and I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end, like he hadn't expected that, like love had become something uncertain to him, and all that realization cut deeper than anything else. Then I told him there would be conditions, not threats, not ultimatums, but conditions, because choices have consequences whether we name them or not. I explained that nothing would be handed over easily anymore, that comfort wouldn't be automatic, that he would have to step out of the life that had made it so easy to look past the people who mattered and into one that required effort, humility, and time. He protested at first, then went quiet, listening as the weight of it settled in, and I could almost see him understanding that this wasn't something he could charm his way out of, that apologies alone wouldn't rebuild what had been cracked. I told him this wasn't about taking something away, it was about giving him the chance to earn back the understanding he'd lost, to learn what real value looks like when it isn't printed on invitations or measured by who gets to stand where. His voice shook when he agreed, when he said he'd do whatever it took, and I believed him in that moment, not because words are enough, but because fear can sometimes open the door to growth if you let it. When the call ended, I sat there staring at the wall, tears finally slipping down without resistance, not from sadness alone, but from the ache of knowing that loving someone sometimes means making their path harder, not easier. I wiped my face, took another steady breath, and felt that familiar, quiet return, the kind that comes after you've chosen a direction and committed to walking it no matter how long it takes. Outside, the night had fully settled in, the world dark and still, and inside my small room I understood that this decision would shape everything that came next, not just for my son, but for all of us, because the rules had changed now, and there was no going back to the way things were before. I went back to my own life after that call, not with relief exactly, but with a quiet acceptance that felt earned, like setting something heavy down after carrying it farther than anyone ever knew. And as I closed the door behind me, the apartment greeted me the same way it always had, familiar, unassuming, honest. I made myself one last cup of tea and sat at the table, the steam curling upward as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. And maybe that was the point, that real change doesn't announce itself. It settles in gently, asking you to live with it day after day. My phone lay silent now, no buzzing, no flashing, just stillness. And for the first time all day, that stillness didn't feel tense. It felt peaceful, like the end of a long conversation where everything that needed to be said finally had been. I thought about my son, about the road ahead of him, longer and harder than the one he'd imagined for himself, and my chest tightened with that familiar mix of love and worry. But there was pride there too, small and cautious, because he would have the chance to learn what I'd tried to teach him all along, that worth isn't something you inherit. It's something you build slowly through choices that don't always feel good in the moment. I stared around the room at the things I'd chosen years ago, the small table, the worn chair, the quiet that had held me through so much, and all I realized I didn't want to trade any of it, not for applause, not for luxury, not for approval that arrives too late. Outside, the city hummed softly, distant traffic, a dog barking, someone laughing far away, life continuing without pause, and I breathed it in, letting myself feel grounded again, rooted in a place that didn't ask me to prove anything to belong. If you've stayed with this story until now, if you felt that mix of hurt and strength, of sadness and clarity, then you already understand why quiet choices matter more than loud victories, and why dignity doesn't need witnesses to be real. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, and turned off the light, not with bitterness, not with regret, but with the steady confidence that comes from knowing who you are and refusing to be anything less. And as I lay down that night, finally letting sleep come, I knew one thing for certain: leaving quietly hadn't made me small. It had shown me exactly how strong I'd been all along. And if stories like this speak to you, stories about quiet strength, hard lessons, and dignity that doesn't beg to be seen, then subscribe for more, because sometimes the most powerful endings are the ones that don't shout at all.